Hi, everyone. Welcome. You are tuning in to the CAA Conversations podcast. So, this is season 9, Discussions on Pedagogy. And today's episode is called Performing Knowledge, Pedagogy, Institutions, and Speculative Frameworks. I'm Darleen. I am an artist, an educator, a researcher for the Selfie Institute for Selfie Studies. And I am really interested in all of the ways that technology is impacting our self-representation in digital spaces. I am here with Edgar Fabián Frías.
Hi, my name is Edgar Fabián Frías, and I'm an artist, an educator, Brujekis. I'm also a psychotherapist based in Los Angeles, and I feel very expansive in terms of like the multiple spaces that I show up. I'm also very interested in the way that institutions are examining, looking at, ignoring the digital realms, and we are here to give some chisme, to talk a little bit about our own personal experiences, and to share some visions, some imaginaries, some futurity. We're here to dream together with you all.
Yes, I love that. And just to give you a little bit about the context of why we are doing this podcast specifically on institutions and pedagogy. So we're really interested in how knowledge frameworks, knowledge sharing, knowledge construction happens, not just through teaching or specific curriculum, but also how they can be thought of as performances, right? How they are relational, durational, social performances. And they are spaces that are shaped by rituals, by language, by this idea of permissions, of legitimacy, of power, and really thinking of how learning happens and how people are able to share different conocimientos, different ways of knowledges, right? And something that I want to highlight is that this is coming from our own experiences. We're both artists, we're both teachers, and we show up in a million multiplicities. And we're just very interested in exploring specifically the relation of institutions, of knowledge making, and also what happens when we talk about more contemporary ways of how institutions are relating to digital practices, to digital knowledge productions.
And I really want to mention that we're grounding this in the idea of performance. And I really want to thank and honor Judith Butler, who is an educator at UC Berkeley. And both Darleen and I went to UC Berkeley as well. And Judith Butler has really brought in this notion, this truth, this idea, this wisdom that gender is performative. And we're really wanting to take pedagogy, institutions, knowledge sharing and making as a performative act as well. And so I just wanted to bring that name in because Judith Butler has been so instrumental in my own understanding of myself as a person, as well as understanding systems in general.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think just like really bringing back to this idea of also gender as an institution and the way that it shows up in the body, I want to start off with the question. And this question is for everyone that's listening to us. How do institutions feel in your body, right? How do they show up in your body? What do they bring up for you? So I want us to just spend a little bit thinking about that, right? When we think about the concept and the idea of an engaging with an institution, what comes up for us? Edgar, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I was here just sitting, connecting with my body and thinking about the many different experiences I've had within institutions. And the first word that came up was trauma, like just thinking about how institutions have been used by the white supremacist colonialist project to really inculcate and, force upon many communities belief systems, ontologies, cosmologies. And so my body just immediately almost like contracted and was like, get me away from those institutions.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for that vulnerability. I definitely agree. I think what comes up for me is difficulty, it's discomfort, it's challenging. And particularly, I think it definitely relates to this idea that that I feel like my communities as a queer Latinx femme, as a first gen, daughter of immigrants, it's really that these institutions never really, I never really felt myself represented or invited into this idea of the institution, right? It almost always felt like there was this illegibility, right? This an inability for me to even understand and access an institution, right? So I think that what you're talking about, this idea of trauma, and I'm sure a lot of you listening in can also relate to this, it's something that's so valid. And I could definitely see that coming up for a lot of people. And I mean, oof, once we specifically, I mean, because when we talk about institutions, like it can apply, there's so many type of institutions that exist out there, right? But when I think too a lot about the education institutions, right? Who are these institutions that are producing knowledge, that are, stewarding knowledge, that are guiding knowledge, that are legitimizing knowledge, right? In terms of education. And then also when we think about art and art practices and aesthetics and concepts, right? When we think about all of these things in relations to institutions, there's a lot of challenges, right, that come up. It's like who is represented, who is not, and who is present, on what terms are they present, under what circumstances, under what guidelines, what are their relations in these institutions. So I think there's so many things to unpack. And obviously, there's so many things that we can touch on. But I think for us, we really just wanted to, again, go back to this performative aspect of the institution, right? If we think of the institution as following a guideline, a script, an infrastructure, right? It is ritual work and it is energetic work. So it doesn't surprise me that like these experiences that we have are very grounded in perhaps like trauma, right? And this confusion. And
Yeah.
I think this is something that you and I always talk about when it comes to digital art as artists that work within digital mediums. This difficulty, right? So, Edgar, can you tell me too a little bit about this relationship that we've talked about before between digital art and the relation to specifically just like institutions and knowledge making? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really want to first off share, when I think of trauma, it is something that is destabilizing. It is something that creates
Oh.
fragmentation. And at the same time, trauma, I see it as the beginning of a journey. And I
Mm.
do feel like even though in my body I can feel closed off to this notion of institutions, I've also grown and developed so much within these spaces. And so I want to name that as well and honor that and talk a little bit
Mm.
about my own experiences of seeing digital art practices within institutional spaces be
Mm.
either invalidated or even like cast away, seen as wicked even. And this
Mm.
is where maybe I'm gonna, give a little bit of cheese man. So
Ooh.
I went to UC Berkeley for my MFA and I was assigned to a couple of classes as a graduate instructor. And I remember having so many students who were really excited to work within the digital realm. And in my classes, I was very open to any kind of media because I'm a pretty interdisciplinary media non-specific artist. So obviously, I want people to play and to
Yeah.
work with whatever makes sense for them. But I got chastised multiple times for having
Mm.
students making too much digital art.
Ooh.
And it was seen almost as if it was lazy, if they weren't growing, as if it
Mm.
was too easy or accessible. And also, I got the message pretty quickly that digital art wasn't real art.
Yeah, Edgar, I think what you're sharing is so important. And I think it also reminds me too a lot about my experience. I did my undergrad at Berkeley. One of my degrees was in art practice. And I just remember really not being exposed to any digital art. Again, this was like in the early 2010s. So just very traditional art. And I remember there was like, if anything, one new media course, but even in all of the art history classes that I remember taking, I don't really remember being exposed to digital art or more contemporary art in that sense, right? With like technology and things like that. And it really wasn't until I graduated and, started kind of like stewarding my own art practice that I started being exposed to artists within my community, learning about artists that are working in contemporary times, that I started seeing like, oh, the digital is an option and you can make art using all of these different tools on the internet and things like that. So I think this what you mentioned about the accessibility of art, of sometimes like making it seem like it's a cop out or it's like it's easier because you're doing something digital. I think it really reminds me of how institutions really get their legitimacy or build their legitimacy from being inaccessible, right? And from being limited, from being
Right.
exclusive, right? And what does that mean when institutions are building kind of like their power around that inaccessibility? What happens for artists like you and me that feel like we don't have the tools, the language, the verbiage to be able to access those institutions, right? And what happens to that knowledge production, right? That it seems kind of out of hand. And I think this is something that you and I always talk about too. And I think this is really comes back to the performative aspect of knowledge making is what happens when certain voices like queer folks, Latinx folks, immigrants, people from the global majority, racialized folks are not seeing themselves within these institutions, right? It is an act of erasure in a way. And I think that that's something that, like, when I think of my job as a teacher and I think about like this performative aspect of wanting to share knowledge, I think for me, the reason that institutions and knowledge making and pedagogy is so performative, it's because you are engaging in energy work in the sense that you are sharing and that you're connecting with someone, right? You're kind of like building on this empathetic space where you want someone to share their ideas at the same time that you're sharing yours. And I think for me, I've always been very careful as not wanting to impose, but rather always start from a question, right? And really grounding in the body. And that's, I think, why I wanted to start off this podcast with the question of how do institutions feel in the body? Because I think the body is very central, right? I think for me, the body is the primordial technology, the primordial infrastructure interface for us to engage with the world and all of these ideas. So tell me a little bit more about this idea for you as institutions as performance. What are some of the things that are coming up for you?
Yeah, I just was really touched by what you just shared and how you're bringing in this notion that when we don't see ourselves, it could be hard to even imagine possibilities. And also this notion that institutions perform inaccessibility, they
Mm,
perform as gatekeepers and also as the holders of what is truth or what is knowledge or what is real, and how that can really create these beliefs about ourselves. And I'm just like really sitting with like how institutions feel like a enclosure or like something
yeah.
that I have to protect myself from. Just thinking so much how, institutions play this little game where they ignore something, they don't validate it, or they like keep it on the fringe until the right moment that they fucking steal as much of it as they can and then co-opt it, bring it into their systems. And
Capitalize
so
on it.
they're capitalize on it. And so there is so much theft that our
Mm,
bodies know that we have
mm,
felt, whether we're indigenous, we're racialized folks, we're women, we're
mm.
femmes, we're queer and trans folks. Like we know that our community's wisdom, our collective efforts have
Yes.
been both like demonized,
Yes.
ignored, invalidated, but then co-opted and stolen. And
Oof.
so these are things that
Oof.
like are performative, right? They're things that
Mm,
happen. You
yeah.
perform ignorance, you perform,
Mm,
invalidation, and
yeah.
then you perform the scholar who's going in to learn about something,
Mm,
then to take it and bring it back to the like high echelons of the university,
yes.
stamp it with your white male name, and all of a sudden it
Mm,
becomes valid.
yeah, it's giving big colonizer energy for sure. For sure. I think this just really reminds me too of institutions at the end of the day, regardless of what they're focusing on, are guiding culture, right? And I think specifically in our context, when we're talking about education institutions, pedagogical institutions, art institutions, they are in a way stewards of culture, right? And it's like what culture is being brought in and for what purpose? Because I'm sure we've also seen it too. This is something that a lot of people say representation is not the end all be all, right? Because we've all seen examples where certain cultures, certain cultural exchanges are brought into these institutions and they're done from an extractive point of view, right? Yeah, I think it's bringing up so many different things. And I think there's so many thoughts and critiques and reflections to say about it. And I want to start shifting into maybe some examples of artists.
Do you mind if we,
Uh,
before we shift, I just wanted to mention something else, I think, just to
yeah, yeah,
like
sure, sure.
add
Go
to
ahead.
this. I think one of the places where I'm coming from is that my family's from Mexico and we are Vidarica.
Mm, mm,
And I think one of the big wounds, one of the heartbreaks I've had in my life is that, through these institutions, I've really tried to reconnect with my indigenous community and
mm,
ancestry. And so many, many, many times, what I've been offered through these institutions is like my community through the lens of a white man.
oof,
And whether it's like a book or it's like a study, and so there's this like anthropological Eurocentric lens that I'm always having to translate through. And
yeah,
so of course, like this is like where I feel like some of my like anger comes from, some of my
yeah.
like lack of trust in these systems, and also
Mm,
an understanding that there is an extraction. And like why aren't Virarica being brought into the university
yeah,
platform? Why isn't there a translator there so that we can
yeah.
learn directly, right? Why does it only exist when it's baptized by these
Mm,
cis white men? This has
yeah,
historically been done to so many different communities. And
yeah.
so I just wanted to highlight that before we transition into talking about some other examples from artists.
Oh, that's so true. And I also just want to highlight and say that, like, that cis white men mentality is also an energy and it's also a concept, right? Because we also know that there have been a lot of people that once they make their way into these institutions, they start repeating that, right? So again, it's not an individual problem. I mean, you can always say like it's the individual, whatever. But again, these are institutional, infrastructural concepts, energies at play that even if someone goes in with the intention to want to platform or want to do things right, just to say something very superficial in general, they're still battling and going against hundreds of years of colonial mentality, right? So I think that's also something very important to highlight. And I think this is why we say like representation isn't not the end all be all, right? It's important for us to have a seat at the table, but we also need to have our own tables, right? Or maybe like remove the table altogether and have like circles and have all these different things. So thank you so much for sharing that because I think that there's so much anger and so much frustration when we start talking about institutions, right? And that's something that Edgar and I talked about is like when we were planning this podcast, it's like there's so much to say and there's so much frustration. And we really wanted to be authentic and vulnerable in talking about that because we cannot talk about the institutions and all of the many beautiful, bountiful ways that we're expanding and imagining and speculating on them without touching on this before, right? Because this is where we're coming from. So I just really want to just ground in that before we transition into some examples. So thank you for bringing all of that up, Edgar. It's so true. And I definitely see your therapist self coming through.
I'm glad you see that because I'm seeing like my activist self here too, you know?
I see it. No, I see it. So now we're going to start transitioning into institutions that's performance, some examples that we've seen, some references that a lot of you may or may not have heard of. So just the ones that really come up to me quickly are obviously the great Coco Fusco. We have the Yes Men. We have Adrian Piper, which Edgar is going to talk to us a little bit more about. But these are just some examples that are really trying to be playfully mimicking authority, right? That are really pulling apart this concept and this idea of how does authority and how does legitimacy look like and feel like? Again, if we're returning to the body, right? This is emotional work. This is performative work. How do we express that as people? How do we express that through the body, right? Because the institution, okay, yes, it's this concept, but institutions are made up of people, right? So how do people really represent and embody that, right? And I think that's something that Coco Fusco has done very well to the Yes Men, obviously. So again, how is credibility staged? And really are like, what are these costumes or these masks that power and legitimacy and authority, right, presents themselves as? So we want to focus on an example that's called the Probable Trust Registry by Adrian Piper. And Edgar, you had the opportunity to actually witness this in person. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, so this happened when I was abroad in Berlin. It was at the Hamburger Bahnhof, and
Mm.
it really met you. This art piece met you the moment you walked in because it was taking up the whole kind of main area of the museum. And so there
Mm.
was already like this grand energy around it. And as you approach the work, you really approached a person who was standing at like a desk, and it really mimicked like going to the DMV or like, approaching someone within an institutional space where
Traumatic.
they, yes, of course. Yeah. And so it was, yeah, it made me think about like how like many people in, let's say, in my family feel scared of going into art museums already. And so even me as someone who's seasoned art viewer, goes to museums all the time, I remember feeling really uncomfortable just like
Mm,
stepping into this piece and knowing that there was going to be some sort of engagement where
mm,
I had to give over information about myself, and I was asked a lot of questions by the person. And there was this
mm,
like, what was interesting, it was like, centered around this idea of trust, but there was also this feeling of distrust, or this feeling that you were
mm,
maybe being questioned, and that your character, your sense of self was being scrutinized. And it really brought forward like what we feel when we go into a lot of these spaces, that we maybe don't feel like we can bring in all of ourselves, or that we have to like put some of ourselves aside to be able to engage and interact. And so I just really found this piece to be so powerful. And for it to be done within an art institutional space really brought up how these spaces can really occlude power, or they can use power in a way where it can make people feel either less than or like it's inaccessible, because I know that you have to have that courage to even go into an art institutional space, because a lot of people can get really triggered going into art spaces feeling like they're not good enough, or it's higher class than them. Like there's so much that these institutions really put out there that can make us
mm,
feel less than. And so I feel like this artwork really was pointing at all the ways that art institutions work with power. And
mm.
as we've been talking about, like it just how this is a ritual, this is performance, and it's meant to have a certain impact on us.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Just from what I've read and seen about this piece, this idea of also signing a contract, right? That you had to like sign a
Yeah.
contract. And what you were saying, it's kind of like this engagement of you're going up to this desk, which is already performing authority, right? Because it's creating this division. So again, what happens of like this physical barrier creates this psychological barrier too. And I think it's so interesting what you mentioned about how you have to sometimes manage, and I think it comes back to this idea of code switching, right? Which is something that a lot of people mention that they all sometimes have to
Mhm.
do, is they have to act or hide themselves or present themselves in a specific way to mitigate the abuses that people feel and have experienced at the hands of different institutions, right? And again, you can think about like, okay, well, an art institution, like what harm can an art institution cause? Or like what harm can like an educative pedagogical university system or
Right.
all of these things cause, right? Like they're just ideas. And I think that always reminds me to this quote of like the pen is mightier than the sword, right? Which is like the impact that
Mm.
words have. Institutions, again, it's something that's embodied. If we think about what words are used, right? The way that you're supposed to talk, the way that you're supposed to engage, all of these things are looking to expect us to act in normative ways for us to be either legible or not by the institution. And if we're not legible and if we're not able to sign this metaphorical social contract, then we're deemed as less than, as not welcomed in, as not reflected. I mean, there's so many things that come up. And again, this relation to the body, right? And to the emotions that really come up. And it makes me think too about how we construct educational spaces and how people feel about education overall, right? And something that I think happens too a lot in arts education is that people have this idea about what an artist is and what an artist should do and what they should focus on. And it's always so interesting to me because I think for me, art is so intuitive and it's so magical and it is also so performative. And in performance, you can start off with parameters, but at the end of the day, you really can't control what comes out. So, I mean, all of these things that you're saying is just goes back to this difficulties of really making space for individuals to show up authentically and really how to steward that, right? So I think that for me, I think the question comes up of like, how do we make sure that institutions are stewards and are vessels where the community feel that they can contribute and that they can pour into, instead of it being this colonial hierarchical infrastructure, right? And that's what also
Yeah.
makes me think too, like the word institution is so charged. So do you think it's a term that we should drop altogether? Should we use new terminology or should we reappropriate that term? What do you think?
Yeah, well, there's power in words, right? And I'm someone who loves to reappropriate and
Yes.
reclaim some of that power. And so I'm just really being inspired right now to talk about this group that worked in this way called ASCO that was
Mm,
in Southern California in Los Angeles. And one
mm-hmm,
of their first big acts that they did as a group, they were a group of Chicane artists who were working together in performance and sculpture and film. And one of their first works was they signed LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. They signed it as if it was something that they were reclaiming for themselves, and this was coming from a place of
mm,
feeling like LACMA was not representing the Latinx, Chicanx communities of Los
yeah.
Angeles. And, now there have been retrospectives of ASCO at LACMA as well as across the world. And so this kind of just showing how this power of reclaiming something, putting your name on it, taking the word, reappropriating it can really do something so profound. And I want to share two more examples that feel
Yeah,
in
please.
alignment with this. That one of them that I've been personally involved with, another one that I've worked with also as well. But the first one is called the Golden Dome. And
Mm.
the Golden Dome is like a pedagogical platform that I've been involved
Ooh.
with. We've run residencies, we've hosted workshops, we've been paid by the city of Los Angeles to have events in downtown. And one of the things I want to mention that was really profound for me, I was brought on as like an educator, as a curator, as an
Mm.
artist. And I would be there at some of our residencies where I was holding space for artists. A lot of these artists were coming from institutional spaces,
Mm.
whether it was art school or grad schools. And I remember having a moment where we were all processing, we were all connecting. The Golden Dome is very metaphysical. We really honor
Love.
intuition. We honor spirituality and our relationship to the cosmos, to the land. And I remember feeling like, wow, this is really like an MFA recovery center or a recovery center for people who've been traumatized by these institutions.
Oh.
So many artists go into MFA programs or into art programs feeling like they're going to be empowered to be more of an artist, to connect more with their sense of artist vision or intuition.
Yeah.
And so many come out feeling either depleted or they feel like they can't even make art anymore. And so it
Mm.
really was a moment where I realized that as like a nomadic, emergent institution, we were really providing a big service to our
Mm.
communities where people could actually heal from the trauma that had been inflicted upon
Mm.
them by these other institutions that, a lot of people paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for.
Right.
Yeah, that's one example, like one that I've been personally involved with. And then another example I wanted to share that's a little bit different is called the Mexicali Biennial. And
Yes.
the Mexicali Biennial is like a platform that was started by a couple of artists, like Ed Gomez, Luis Hernandez. There's a few other folks who were involved, and they were again responding to this lack of Latinx, Chicanx artists being brought into
Mm.
institutional biennials. If you don't know what a biennial is, it's something that happens every few years. And lots of times it's like kind of like we talked about with institutions, it's guiding culture. It's saying like, this is what's important. This is what you
Mm.
should focus on. And
Mm.
there was such a lack of artists from both the US and Mexico or other countries of the South that they wanted to bring in more of these artists and create a nomadic platform that would then serve as a kind of almost like counter protest biennial. And of course, now this Mexicali
Love.
biennial has happened for several years. and it happens both in Mexicali and in the US. There's actually one coming up in 2026 and 2027 that
Wow.
has the theme of paranormal borders, which I think is really exciting.
Ooh.
And yeah, this notion that like borders, as we've talked about, are these like gatekeeping spaces, or this way that our
Mm.
communities have been fractured or separated. And
Mm.
then artists come in, or organizers come in, curators come in to create kind of passageways or bridges, or to thread and reconnect our communities back together. And so just,
Yeah.
I think, really inspired by this notion of reclaiming, I really do see the power in kind of taking some of that trauma and saying, okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to work with you. I'm going to play with you. I'm going to create something out of you.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for sharing all of those examples. And I think like I am definitely very called to this idea of how border work is also liminal work. But I think when we're talking about reclaiming, I think that it is very important, to reclaim. And when it comes to this term or idea of institutions, I don't think it's one of those things that like, you throw everything out. I think that there is a lot of institutions, there's a lot of projects, initiatives that are working within this idea of institution and that again are appropriating this performative aspect of institution and that are really asking us to look critically at what has happened and where we want to go, right? So I definitely do think that it is one of those things that I agree. We can have many different terms for it, but I do think that there's still power in naming and using institution. And I think this is going to be a good segue for our second episode, which in our second episode, we're going to be talking about more specific examples about how Edgar and I are speculating or really leaning into this speculative performance of the institute and the knowledge framework archive. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on too about this idea of the Mexicali biennial and working cross geographies and really working with artists and like this liminal sense of, how institutions, and specifically when we start talking more about in digital and like the internet and, contemporary knowledge making institutions, we have to give them space to expand and take up geographies, right? Whether those be like physical geographies or more like conceptual spaces as something as like the internet, right? Which is so vast and is also so expansive. So I think that there's just so much potential for institutions to really take stock of what's happened, of what's working, what's not, and really give space for something new to come through, right? I think, these cracks, these fissures are portals, right? It's also where leaks happen, is kind of like this mushy space of potentiality and of creation. And I think that coming into this podcast, this is something that Edgar and I really wanted to talk about, was the way that we are working within our current contexts, being part of all these different initiatives, of all these projects, of all these institutions, talking to friends, talking to artists, talking to educators, and seeing all of these things that come up that are, again, structural, that are relational, that are really pushing us to question and to imagine possibilities where we see ourselves not only reflected in institutions, but where we are actively constructing, building, and questioning, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I really want to ground the reason that we're wanting to focus on digital is because there's so much power in looking at a practice that has been ignored, demonized, vilified, and to think about how there's power in that as well. And
Mm.
I think one of the things that I feel like is connected to what you were just sharing, I love that you bring in the cracks and the portals and the fissures,
Mm.
because it really
Mm.
reminds me of Legacy Russell's glitch
Oh,
feminism
yes.
and the power of the glitch and the power of the digital to be something that is so expansive that it is amorphous. It can exist on a screen. It can exist
Mm.
in your consciousness as a meme. It can be physicalized on a billboard or on
Yes.
skyscraper. It can be
Yeah.
placed in so many different ways. And because of that, it refuses
Mm.
to be contained. And
Mm,
this reminds me so much as like a personal thing that I've experienced as an artist is as an indigenous, Latinx, non-binary queer artist, I have felt so much like I've had to stay within a certain lane when it comes
mm,
to art making. Like you're a
yeah.
screen printer girl or you paint or like your people
Mm.
make this kind of work. And I remember feeling so much like, can I still be an indigenous artist if I make digital work? And like even the fact that I have that kind of
Oh.
question really speaks to the ways that our
Yeah.
mindsets have been colonized, that the
Mm,
regimentations have been placed in there. And so
mm,
we're also wanting to talk about the digital as a possibility to
mm,
really expand beyond these colonial notions and regimentations. And I think that that is one of the reasons why it is seen as
mm.
dangerous. The digital is seen as something that is a problem within the
Oof.
art realm because it
Yes.
refuses to adhere to these notions. And so just
Yes.
wanted to bring in my own personal experience and also really speak to why the two of us as digital artists who are also transdisciplinary, that
Mm.
we really want to highlight the potentiality of the digital, as well as in this moment, as we're making this podcast,
Yes.
how little pedagogy there is around digital art practices. So we're also wanting to call that out and be like, hey, if you're a scholar, if you're someone who's been scared of or told that the digital is valueless, there is
Mm.
something there to get curious about and
Mm.
explore.
I love that. I love that. The calling out, the calling in. I think it's really, again, this question of discomfort of this is something new. I
Mhm.
mean, if we talk about the digital and digital art practices, I mean, within the last 40 years at most, right? And then, particularly for us, at least for me, that's working a lot with social media practices too. New media practices on social networks, social media, on phone, 15 years at most, right? So we also have to realize, and this is something that we always talk about too, is just like we also have to be compassionate with ourselves to know that these are practices that are emerging, and it's very difficult to kind of even realize everything that's happening because it's happening so fast. But I think we're at the right time to really start talking about these and questioning these things and asking, why is this so difficult and what is the discomfort? And oftentimes, again, when something is causing us discomfort, it's because it's the unknown, right? It's something that we can't box. And I really want to lean into this idea of the shapeshifter. I think like these past years for me, like have really been that trickster shapeshifter energy. And it really is about that expansiveness and the liminality and the multidimensionness of something, right? And I think that's something that's so powerful of the digital because it can exist in so many different ways, in so many places at once, in so many different forms, right? And if we go back to what you were talking about, like, gender and performativity and Judith Butler, that's one of the discomforts that we're seeing, particularly with certain social groups being targeted, right? It's because it's challenges this idea of institutionalized notions of boxing things in, right? The institution wants everything nice, it wants everything organized, categorized, and we have to be able to accept that sometimes it has to be a little bit messy, right? The archive can't be 100% perfect. We can't categorize everything, right? That's colonial mindset. When we think of nature, nature is also so liminal, it's so expansive. It shapes in so many ways, right? If we think of water, water has so many different forms, right? So I think like going back to indigenous knowledge stewardship, right? It's also acknowledging that we have to know that there are phases and there are times and seasons for everything, right? So I think that that's something that we're really coming to when it comes to knowledge institutions. And I just want to, highlight as we're coming to the end of this podcast that all of this has been said and contextualized as a little exercise in releasing because we're going to start talking about the ways that Edgar and I are looking at this within our own pedagogical, professional, artistic practices as educators as well. And we're going to be talking about our project. So I'm going to be talking about the Selfie Institute for Selfie Studies, and Edgar is going to be talking to us about.
The Museum of Multidimensional Mutant Maps, that is very much in conversation with a lot of the themes that we've been talking about today. And I really want to thank you for bringing in the Trickster. especially
Mm,
within indigenous cosmologies. A trickster is always the sacred being that opens
mm,
up ceremonial space. And we've been talking about ritual,
mm.
performativity. And I feel like the trickster is such a bountiful energy to bring into
Yes.
this podcast as we move into talking a little bit more about our own projects. I want to just really invite in this trickster energy to
Yes.
really shift and help decalcify,
Yes.
deregiment, open up possibility and space because the trickster as a liminal being can really help
Mm.
us laugh and move and shift. And so if you've been kind of, listening to us, I want to invite you in your body to like maybe move a little bit, like shake a little bit, because we have been
Mm.
talking about some really heavy things and we're going
Mhm.
to bring in some of that levity, some of that joy, some of that
Mm.
playful possibility in our next episode as we share a little bit more about our artistic projects.
Yes, I really like that. And again, I think we want to end on this note because it really is about being playful, right? And really connecting to that energy of the questioning and the possibility of imagining other ways of doing and being. And again, these have been very challenging conversations. Again, there's so many more things that we can say. I know that all of you have so many ideas, so many emotions, which I invite you to comment, to share with us. We would love to read you. We would love to hear about how this is relating to your experience. Again, this is just coming from our experience, but there's so many other ways that this is sitting for all of us in these communities. But yeah, I really want to lean into that trickster liminal being because I think that's really when we start talking about these projects, that's the energy that we want to embody, right? We want to be playful and we want to show that institutions don't have to be scary, that institutions can be playful, can be silly, can be always in the process of change. So I just kind of want to end on that note, just really thanking all of you for having the vulnerability and the audacity to also listen to what we have to say. These are just our sassy little opinions, which I'm sure a lot of you can connect to. But yeah, just really thanking you for holding this space for us to kind of just share our experiences and our dreams and our possibilities. So I'm definitely inviting you to tune into our second episode where we'll be delving into the way that we are expanding all of these practices. And yeah, Edgar, what do you want to tell us to close out this session?
Well, I want to just say, in the name of being expansive and moving through these
Mm,
portals, this is going to exist as both a podcast, and we're really grateful to
yes.
CAA for hosting us. And we
Mhm.
also want to say that this is also going to be on YouTube in case you want to be in dialogue
Ooh.
with us, because we know podcasts can feel very much like a one-way conversation, but we
Mhm.
want to invite you in. And so find us on YouTube. It will be under the same name, and leave us a comment because we want to hear from you as well.
I love that. Yes. So again, we're existing in many multidimensional ways. So thank you so much, Edgar. Thank you so much for everyone who's been listening. This has been the CAA Conversations podcast, discussions on pedagogy. And this is Darleen and Edgar wishing you a beautiful, bountiful day. And we can't wait to share with you in our second episode.